So this morning's passage is primarily a passage about discipleship, the cost of discipleship. We see that as people, come and question Jesus, but also in the responses of the villagers to his presence, to his coming to them. But it's also a story about God's profound love for humanity. That's at the heart of all of this, because it's at the heart of Jesus' mission and why he's there calling for disciples, why he's there asking people to follow his way, is because at its heart is God's love for humanity. We're told at the very beginning of this passage, Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem. We know that for Luke's Gospel, this is, looking towards the cross. When Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem, it's the task that he's been walking towards. But now there's a shift where it's a deliberate move to go towards Jerusalem and all that means, and the rejection that he knows may come as he goes that way, as he brings God's love to those people. What's interesting is that we're told he then goes through these Samaritan villages. So Jesus' ministry was also to the Samaritans, so the non-Jewish people. The Samaritans were like the ugly cousins for the Jews, in a sense. They were quite related, but they hated each other because they felt that each other was wrong about, the way they understood worshipping God, and so they had some fairly bitter arguments over that. And so the Samaritans were seen as being completely other. And Jesus goes to them on his way to Jerusalem, which is geographically out of the way. It's not the direct way that he would have normally gone. So we see that Jesus is deliberately taking God's love to those who are other, those who are outside the family of God already, if you want to look at it in those terms. But the first village Jesus comes to refuse his hospitality, and the only reason that Luke gives us is that it's because he set his face to Jerusalem. Now, some of the commentators think that, well, maybe it's about they had this bitter argument over Jerusalem, and the place of the holy city of God and where the temple was and that sort of thing, because the Samaritans had their own temple and their own idea of where God's mountain was, and that was part of the rivalry. And so it could be just something where we say, oh, well, if he's one of them, then we don't want him to come and preach in our town. It could be as simple as that. But in some ways, Luke's not really interested. He doesn't really care what the reason is. He certainly doesn't make a big deal of it. Just that they refuse Jesus' ministry. And we have this funny scene where James and John says, oh, should we call down fire on this village that has rejected you? And, good 21st century people as we are, go, oh, terrible disciples, why would they do that? You have to remember that Elijah had done exactly that a couple of times. And this very passage that we're reading is right after Jesus has had the transfiguration on the mountaintop, you remember, and the disciples, James and John, see Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. And so maybe this has put the Elijah stories in their mind or something like that. But it's not a crazy, outlandish idea in many religious senses. Jesus would not be going outside what had been done before and being apparently God's will. So when Jesus says no, and Luke doesn't make a big deal of what the rebuff is and how he rebukes the disciples. We don't get the words or anything like that. But just that he says no and he rebukes them, we have a very clear message that violence, that force is not part of Jesus' embodying God's profound love to his people. When you think about it, that Jesus is inviting people into God's kingdom, he's sharing God's love, and we have with that a very definite no, that does not include violence towards people who reject it. It does not include aggressive forcing it on people who don't want to receive it. And that's an important part of a collection of stories about discipleship. Jesus is not about to force himself on a township or on individuals who reject him. And there's no sense of violence against them. That would be then a threatening force that do this or else. That's not part of the invitation into God's love. So we have, they're moving on to another village, and we find 3 scenarios, I would suggest. The first person comes up and says, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus says, this line about foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Now, we don't really know whether the man then followed or not, but the way Jesus speaks gives us the impression there was a negative response after him telling this person that. But in essence, as I understand it, Jesus is saying to this person, you need to leave behind all the comforts. Are you ready to do that? All of the things that you are used to, the places that make you comfortable, the things that you're comfortable with and doing. If you came with me, you'd have to leave that all behind. It's not simply about having a home, or, God doesn't call every one of us to leave our homes and go on missionary work somewhere overseas and to not have a home. There are some people who are called to that. When you think about all of the monks, all of the Christian brothers and nuns who have taken poverty in various shapes across the world, there are many, many people still today who have taken a vow of no possessions. No possessions. It's not crazy and outlandish, but it's also not something that God calls most of us to. But what he does call us to is to leaving things behind. I don't know if you noticed in that early hymn we sung, The Summons, through the 5 verses, there's a whole range of things that we might be called to, that discipleship might include. And a number of them were going beyond our comfort zones, going beyond the things that we would ordinarily do. Would we do them if Jesus called us to them? Kiss the leper clean. Things like that. I don't know about you. That one made me sort of cringe inside. I thought, I don't know if God called me to do that. If he called me to go to, Pacific Islands and missionary work, I've done that, been there, quite comfortable. That was, in some ways, out of ordinary comfort zones. But we all have areas that we think, oh, no, I'm not sure I'd do that if. And the question is, if Jesus called you to, could you leave behind your comfortable place and step out in faith into areas that are a bit scary, where you feel a bit vulnerable? Often in ministry, I have to remind myself, and it's the same for many of you, you might have a role, you might have a job title that almost affords you a professionalism because you're comfortable there. You have skills there that almost act to keep you safe. You have an understanding and a knowledge base there. And God sometimes calls you to step over here, and there's a vulnerability, there's almost a nakedness about leaving behind the roles and the knowledge base and the intelligence and the expertise over here and stepping into a role or into just being with someone when you have no role. As Linda said, just going to care for somebody who's a neighbour or a friend. You're not there to help or to heal or to, as a professional. You're there as a Christian, as a neighbour, as a friend. And maybe you don't have the answers at all. Maybe they're dealing with stuff you have no knowledge of. If God called you to step over there where your knowledge base is zero, your comfort level is zero, would you do that? Knowing that you're going because it's Jesus' way. The next person that comes along to Jesus is an interesting one. He says, I need to, I want to come and follow you, but I just need to bury my father. And as Andrew alluded to earlier with the children, most of the commentators assume that this means he has these, eldest son responsibilities to look after things and to bury his father and sort out the affairs, but that his father may not yet be dead. It's not like a 2-day thing, or go home and we'll have the burial, or we'll do... this person is asking for something bigger than that. Nobody genuinely expects Jesus to say, oh, no, I'm sorry, well, if that's going to be, an hour and a half, we won't be here anymore. It's not that kind of a story. This person is, we understand their request is, I want to follow you, Jesus. I want to walk in your way, but I have these other commitments. And I'll do those first, then I'll have time for you, God. And those other commitments can all seem very genuine and very important, and in some ways, many of the things that God has in fact given us as part of who we are in this world. Family is one of them. I often think, well, yes, I'm a minister, but I'm also a husband. And I'm also a father. God has called me to those roles too. What I don't see is happening here is that God is saying, well, you have to follow Jesus over and against being a father or a husband. I'm going to make you choose between one or the other in a positive sense. What I would understand is when we follow Christ, our priorities shift. It's not like we are just following Christ 1 minute and can all of a sudden do something else another minute. Or that we can be doing something else and say, right, well, on Sundays I'll follow you, Jesus. It's a priority shift. And what Jesus is saying is following Christ and walking in his way goes to the top of the priority list. And it's not that you should have family and partners below that necessarily. It is that way, but it's not either or. God calls us to being both and. We are husbands and wives. We are mothers and fathers. We are also Christians. And it's almost very rarely that being a husband calls me to not be a minister or to not be a Christian. That being a father is saying, well, if you're really my father, you won't go to church on Sunday. Well, that just doesn't usually happen. It's not very often that family or partners are actually saying, in order for you to show me love, you need to do something that is not Christian. Do you know what I mean? It's almost never the case that I have to choose between following Jesus' way, doing what God would want me to do, and also being those other things. So when this man says, I need to go and bury my father, if it was a simple matter of being a husband or being a son, Jesus would have said, that's fine. But when he's putting other things ahead of following Jesus, and those other things mean that he can't follow Jesus, can't be a Christian and walk in the way of Christ, then there is something wrong. And it's a little bit similar to the third person that comes and says, I'm going to follow you. I just need to go and say goodbye to all my family and friends. If it was as simple as, a 10-minute trip, Jesus would have said, right, no problems. But when it's looking back, when we have our hands on the plough, but we're actually looking back to some other job, to some other thing, we're not really doing this one, are we? We're not really in the right place. And I thought about all those times in Scripture when people were looking back to where they'd come from. You think of the Israelite people who just left Egypt, and the slavery, and we're told, terrible conditions, worse and worse and worse conditions. Things were getting harder and harder. And as soon as Moses takes them out into the desert, and things get a little bit tricky, and things start to challenge them, and the road is rougher than they thought, they start looking back to, at least when we were slaves, and in between the beatings and the making bricks, we had pretty good soup, didn't we? Hey, how good was that? And to many of us, we think it's a strange thing to think. How could they have possibly been looking back to slavery because the road of freedom was tough? But we do. In our own ways, we do. You think about Lot's wife that was, on the escape and running with his husband, with her husband, but turned back. What to? What for? We don't really know, but looking back and longing to be where we were before we knew God, it's not part of God's kingdom. It's not part of Jesus' way. Looking back to a time when we didn't have to be Christians, or, God hadn't shown us what being a Christian was, and longing for those days, that's not part of Jesus' way. I was thinking about, this in terms of making a decision and changing direction, that if I'm going in this direction, or maybe I'm going over here, but God comes into my life and I start walking this way because I'm walking Jesus' way. Now, if I turn back, I'm actually no longer where I was, and I'm no longer over there. Because if I've been walking Jesus' way, I've changed direction, and I'm going in a new direction. And to want to be back here is not just simply, a fleeting temptation. It's actually longing to be back where you were before you knew God. And that's not what Jesus is calling us to. This passage is a series of stories about people's reactions to an opportunity to follow Jesus. As I said, I'm assuming that most of the people in these stories don't respond positively, having heard what Jesus says, because there is a cost. Sometimes we forget the cost is real. But Jesus is being honest. Following my way will mean leaving behind certain things. He doesn't say, this will be all easy, and as soon as you become a Christian, your life will be perfect and you'll never have difficulty again, and God will look after you and nothing bad will come your way. That's not how Jesus phrases discipleship, following in his way. What we see here is fairly realistic. It's fairly honest. Discipleship is not a momentary or a part-time thing. It's a life-changing shift in direction and priorities, where our human needs and wants become subservient to the call of Christ. During the week I had a service of dedication of a bunch of new pilots and officers in the Air Force, and so it's a real privilege to be able to talk to them and to help them to reflect on what it is to dedicate themselves to the Air Force and to their future career and serving and leading. And so we actually have them making a series of promises that they are going to lead in the future with courage and with honesty and with integrity and respectfulness, including all sorts of people, irrespective of their makeup. And they make a bunch of these promises that they will lead in this kind of way and serve in this kind of way. You know, for them to then later on, looking back, you know, having made these promises and dedicated themselves to walk that journey. Can you imagine them in a few years down the track? There's somebody there, oh, well, I made a promise to lead with courage and lead with honesty and respectfulness, but, you know, I kind of feel like leading disrespectfully or dishonestly, or, you know, I think maybe it's kind of crazy to think that they might one day go, well, I feel like being not courageous today, a bit cowardly. I think I'll lead out. We don't decide that, but sometimes we're led to do those kind of things. As we are following Jesus, as we take this journey of being a disciple, sometimes we are tempted. Sometimes we mess up. Sometimes we live our discipleship out of the shadow side of our lives. Whether it's, you know, a lack of courage, whether it's a lack of honesty, whether it's a lack of commitment or integrity, whatever it might be. Sometimes we do make decisions. We take steps going forward, but it's actually out of those dark places within ourselves. But Jesus here is saying, don't go back to where you were before you knew God. When you walk my path, walk and follow and heed that call, but keep going forward. Keep your eyes on the way of Christ. Because we dedicate ourselves to walk Jesus' way. We have chosen in the past, and we could almost reaffirm here and now, as followers of Christ, as Christians, we walk forward without force or violence to those who might reject the faith. We share with those who are in need, those who may not know God. We're not afraid of them. We don't leave them alone to their own devices. We take Christ to those people who are in need and living without Him. We leave behind our comfort zones. We swap our priorities to look like God's kingdom for Jesus and His way, forsaking all others, other loves, other gods, other masters, to follow Jesus and His way. That's our commitment to Christ. We make it this day, but sometimes we need to make it over and over and over and remind ourselves we have promised ourselves to Him and to His way. Let's pray. Loving Lord God, we give You our thanks that Jesus has come into our lives and has called us and walked before us, that we can see His footsteps, that we can know the way to walk, that we can walk with confidence how He's shown us and taught us and led us and guides us. That we go knowing that He's with us always, knowing that He's there if we get confused, if we get our directions mixed, if we're not sure which way to turn. We know we're not alone. When we have questions, we know Jesus walks with us and we can go in His way. So we thank You for the life of Christ that speaks into our hearts, for the Spirit of Christ comes and teaches our minds and hearts what is good and is right. That the Spirit teaches us to love justice and mercy. And we will walk humbly with our God.